Okay, so we're gonna replace this Badlands winch controller right here with this winch controller. So the first thing we're going to want to do is remove the battery because it's really hard to get to these three screws right here when the battery's in the way. So you're going to need a 7/16 ratchet and or a 7/16 inch wrench. Normally when you turn these, there's a serrated flange nut in the back, so the bolts will come out. If the nut spins on the back side and won't let you get the bolt out, you just need to put a 7/16 wrench on the back of it. Once you take the bolt and that off, make sure to grab these nuts off the back and don't lose them. To get these off, you're going to need some 8mm wrenches. If you don't have two 8mm wrenches, you can try using pliers. Some of these may have a Phillips head on it. Needle nose pliers would work good, or maybe even a small crescent wrench that's adjustable. If you're replacing the battery, you may have new hardware that comes with the battery. You can use that. If not, make sure you don't lose these washers. Sometimes there's two flat washers and a lock washer on these connections right here. And take these off one at a time. And if you want, you can, since you have the battery loose, you can turn it like this, help you access it. This is also smart to take the battery out because that way you can't accidentally short circuit something, which a lot of times happens if you're working with a tool in here. You can short circuit it and it'll really scare you when it sparks. Alright, so we got the battery out. Next step is to start changing the wires out. Okay, so this is the remote receiver that we're replacing. Here's the wire. It's got 4 wires. 3 of them go to these small screw terminals here, and the 4th one goes to here, which also has a bunch of other wires connected to it as well. So you need to make sure that you put all those back on when you're done. What I recommend is that you get your new remote receiver and you set it right here and you swap out 1 wire at a time, and that way you won't get confused. It'll help you keep track of what's what a little bit better. Then once you get all the wires swapped out, you can physically remove this and install this. Just before you get started, be aware of which way you're going to route your wires. We're gonna hook them up like this, and then the wires will route around to the back and go under this little thing right here. Okay, so we're going to start with this terminal here. There's a white wire and a brown wire going to it. The brown wire is going to stay on here. The white wire is for the remote, so we're going to swap it. Be careful with these screws. If you lose these, it's very hard to get replacements because they're tiny screws. So we got that screw out. Now we're going to get rid of this white wire and replace it with this white wire. But remember, we still need this brown wire. So this is where it gets tricky. This is kind of cumbersome. And then also be aware of where your wires are routing so you don't get tangled. So you need to go through both ring terminals and then go into the contactor. The screw is not very long, so sometimes you may have to bend these ring terminals a little bit or push hard on the screwdriver to get the screw seated. So there we've done our first wire. The next one we're going to do is the middle one. This is real easy as well because it's got 2 black wires. So we'll remove the screw. Make sure to keep all the washers on there. Don't let it go flying like I just did. So we're removing the black wire that's going to the remote receiver. and we're going to replace it with the black wire coming from the new receiver. And then same thing, we're going to get our screw. If you have a smaller than standard screwdriver, a Phillips, that tends to work pretty good, but you don't, it's not necessary. Again, this is cumbersome. If these are too wide, the screw won't go in. If they're too narrow, they interfere with each other, so you just got to kind of find the sweet spot. Don't force this screw in if it's not going in. See, right now I'm twisted a little bit, so I got to straighten it, find where the hole is, and then thread it in. Alright, so next we're going to go with this green wire. This wire will be green. Sometimes this might be a different color, like black or blue, but it doesn't really matter. Once we get that out, get rid of our wire that goes to the old receiver. And this is where we have a color change. There is no green wire coming from the receiver. Instead, it's yellow. So we're going to put our screw through the yellow, and not to forget the green. And get our screw seated. And there we go. We have one wire left, and that's this one. For that, you're going to need a 10 millimeter, either a wrench or a ratchet and socket. Take that nut off, and in this case we're lucky because the very first ring terminal on top is the one we're needing to remove. If it wasn't, we would have to take off ring terminals until we got to it, remove it, and then put the other ones back on. You can see there's quite a bit. There's going to be 4 or 5 ring terminals on here. So let's get the new red wire from the new remote, put that on there. Sometimes you'll have a washer. If you do, go ahead and use the washer. Put this back on. Now, this is just a mock-up, so we don't have wires going to these other lugs, but in your case you will. So it's very important as you tighten this to make sure these wires are arranged in a way where they're not going to be touching the other wires or the other lugs here. Everything's pretty well insulated, so it's not a big deal, but we just like to create separation so that just in case you know, the insulation were to be rubbed off, you're not going to get a short circuit or anything. Now when you tighten these, a lot of times they will rotate on you. So if that happens, you just loosen and then resituate and tighten again. See, as I tighten, they're wanting to rotate clockwise. So if when I get it tight, they're too far clockwise, we just back it out, rotate them counterclockwise a little bit further, and then tighten. This needs to be really tight. When I say really tight, I don't mean like super tight. I mean it's you don't want it to back off, but you can break these. So just look for the sweet spot where you know that nut is tight and it's never going to back off. So at this point, you're going to want to check your work, and you can see that the wires are all going to the correct receiver. You can see that the old wires to the old receiver have been removed, and you know you can double check, make sure your color coding is right. Some of these may have different colors. If your colors are not matching up to what I'm telling you, you can get in touch with us, and we'll let you know. Some of the older model receivers had a different wire color scheme. So The next step is going to be to remove this and mount this. This blue wire is actually the antenna, and that wire, or that ring terminal, is going to have the mounting screw go through it, which is going to make that screw and turn it into an antenna. So let's go ahead and get started getting this off. Okay, to remove this receiver, you just take an 8mm wrench, put it in the back on the nut, and then take these screws out. You're not going to want to reuse these screws. They're too long for the new receiver. You're going to want to use the ones that we sent you. Alright, once you got it loose, slide it out this way. Be careful with the wires. Make sure you don't pull anything else out in the process. And there you're clear. To install this, first we're going to route this blue wire behind here like this. And then we're going to slide the new remote receiver in, making sure the wires are on this side over here. At this point you'll need the new mounting screw. That's going to go through this ring terminal on the blue wire, and then we're going to go through the new remote receiver and into this mounting hole. This is the right hand side mounting hole for the old receiver. And then you're going to take one of these flange nuts, screw that onto the back side, then take your screwdriver and tighten this screw. Because this is a serrated flange nut, a lot of times you don't even need a wrench. You can tighten without one. If it does try to spin, you'll need an 8mm wrench on the back side. Obviously the mounting hole over here is not going to reach. The newer models have a new mounting hole, but yours isn't going to have that. So one screw is perfectly sufficient to mount that in place. And that's it. You are done. Now you have to put the battery back in and you should be good to go. The battery installation is just the reverse of the removal. Slide your battery back into place. You're going to get this plate and put your bolts through into the holes. And then on the back side, put this larger serrated flange nut. Thread that on there. Sometimes there's not much bolt to work with, but you'll get it. Once you get those on there, you're going to need 7/16, either wrenches or a socket and ratchet. It's very important that you tighten these evenly. If you don't, you can end up pinching the battery on one side. So go back and forth one to the other, tightening them a little bit at a time. You don't want these super duper tight because we're not trying to squeeze the battery. But you don't want them too loose because you don't want the battery to fall out. Alright, so once we get that tight, it's time to reconnect our wires. So before you hook up your battery wires, you want to double check all your wiring over there and make sure everything looks good so you don't have a short circuit when you connect the battery. It's impossible to put this one on and show you for the camera at the same time, so I went ahead and put that one on, but I'm going to show you how to do it on the front terminal here. If you're replacing the battery, use the hardware that came with your new battery. You should have a screw, and I've already got a flat washer put on there. We're going to go through the ring terminal and then through the battery terminal. Then we're going to put another flat washer on the other side, and then if you have a split lock washer, put that on, and then finally the nut goes on the end. This is kind of cumbersome to work with, especially the one in the back. If you want, you can try to connect these before you actually mount the battery and make it a little bit easier. And you're gonna have to edit out this pause because I lost the fucking 8mm. Alright. So to tighten these, you're going to want to use 8mm wrenches or an 8mm wrench and an 8mm socket on a ratchet. Make sure your wires are routed properly. Yours is probably going to have bigger wires than the ones that are on here. These need to be very tight, because if they're not tight, you'll get arcing here. And arcing will cause a bad connection here, or it could melt part of the wire. So once you get these two tight, you're pretty much done. You can double check if you want to try to hook this up without putting the cover on and test it before you go through all that trouble. It's possible to do that.